On the afternoon of June 15, 1864, the city of Petersburg, Virginia, lay almost completely undefended. Behind its 10 miles of earthworks stood a garrison of old men and young boys, fewer than 3,000 of them, hastily armed by a Confederate general who did not have enough real soldiers left to cover the line. In front of those earthworks stood a Union force nearly 6 times that size. The road to Richmond ran through this city. Cut it off, and the Confederate capital could not be supplied. Cut it off, and Robert E. Lee's army would be forced out of its trenches to fight in the open, on Grant's terms at last. For a few hours that afternoon, the entire war was there for the taking. And then it wasn't, not because the Confederates fought brilliantly, not because Grant's plan collapsed. It slipped away because of hesitation, a string of small, forgivable-sounding delays that added up to 9 more months of trench warfare, thousands more dead on both sides, and a war that could have ended in the summer of 1864, instead grinding on into the spring of 1865. This is the story of the battle Ulysses S. Grant should have won in an afternoon, and how he let it slip through his fingers over 4 agonizing days. A new plan after a disaster. 12 days earlier, Grant had ordered his army into the fortified Confederate lines at Cold Harbor and watched nearly 7,000 of his men fall in less than an hour. It was, by his own later admission, the one assault of the entire war he most regretted ordering. But Grant did not retreat after Cold Harbor, and he did not pull back to Washington the way so many Union commanders before him had after a bloody defeat. He did something almost no one expected. He kept moving south. If he could not destroy Lee's army in open battle, he would go around it entirely. Petersburg was the target, a rail junction 24 miles south of Richmond, where 5 separate railroads converged to feed and supply the Confederate capital. Take Petersburg, and Richmond would starve. Take Petersburg, and Lee would have no choice but to come out from behind his trenches. The entire plan depended on one thing above all else: speed. Grant needed his army in front of that city before Lee understood what was happening. The city was open. On June 15th, the vanguard of Grant's army, the XVII Corps under Major General William F. Baldy Smith, crossed the Appomattox River and marched on Petersburg. What Smith found should have been the best news of his entire military career. The Confederate defenses, known as the Dimmock Line, were manned by a scratch force under General P.G.T. Beauregard, a garrison so thin it was staffed largely with old men and boys who had never expected to hold off a real army. Smith outnumbered them by a factor of more than 6 to 1. He had every advantage a Civil War commander could ask for, and he hesitated. Baldy Smith's fatal pause. Smith had been at Cold Harbor. He had watched, up close, what happened when a Union commander attacked entrenched positions without proper preparation, and he was determined not to repeat it. It was a reasonable instinct born from a real trauma, but reasonable instincts, applied at the wrong moment, can be just as costly as recklessness. Expecting the arrival of Winfield Scott Hancock's II Corps to support him, Smith delayed his attack until 7 o'clock in the evening, burning away nearly the entire afternoon of daylight he had been given. When he finally did attack, it worked. His men used a ravine to slip behind one of the Confederate strongpoints, panicking its defenders, and the collapse spread down the line. By nightfall, Union troops had overrun batteries 3 through 12 of the Dimmock Line. The Confederate garrison had been driven back in disarray to a shallow secondary position at Harrison's Creek. The road into Petersburg was, for all practical purposes, open. The night the war could have ended. This is the moment historians keep coming back to, the single decision that has drawn more second-guessing than almost any other in the entire Petersburg campaign. Smith had broken the Confederate line. Darkness had fallen. And rather than press forward into a city that had nothing left to stop him, Smith chose to halt and wait for morning. It is one of the most consequential decisions to do nothing in the entire war. Grant would later write in his memoirs that he believed then, and still believed, that Petersburg could have been captured that very night. Modern historians who have gone back through the records in extraordinary detail have reached much the same conclusion, that a coordinated push by Smith and Hancock's arriving corps that same evening would very likely have taken not just the Dimmock Line, but the city itself. Hancock's corps, meanwhile, had been delayed getting to the field at all, and by some accounts, neither Hancock nor his superior, George Meade, had even been properly informed of how close the breakthrough actually was. The information that should have triggered an immediate, overwhelming follow-up attack simply never reached the men who could have delivered it. Beauregard's desperate bluff. While Union commanders slept on their gains, the Confederate commander on the other side of the line did not sleep at all. P.G.T. Beauregard understood exactly how close Petersburg had come to falling. Through the night, he stripped his other defensive positions almost bare, pulling every soldier he could find away from the Bermuda Hundred lines to the north and rushing them into a new, hastily built defensive position behind Harrison's Creek. It was a gamble. If the Union Army had renewed its attack at first light with full force, there would not have been enough Confederates left to stop it. The attack did not come with full force. Union assaults on June 16th and 17th continued, but in scattered, uncoordinated waves rather than one concentrated blow, enough to keep the pressure on, not enough to break through. Every hour that passed without a decisive Union strike was another hour for Beauregard to plug gaps in his crumbling line, and another hour for the truth of what was happening at Petersburg to reach Robert E. Lee. The window closes. By June 18th, Lee finally understood that Petersburg, not Richmond, was where Grant's real blow was falling, and he rushed the bulk of the Army of Northern Virginia south to meet it. When Grant ordered a full assault along the entire Confederate line that day, the window that had stood open on the afternoon of June 15th had slammed permanently shut. The Confederates, now reinforced and well entrenched, cut the attacking Union soldiers to pieces. The 1st Maine heavy artillery alone lost more than 600 men in 10 minutes, the worst single-day regimental loss suffered by any unit in the United States Army during the entire war. Grant called off the assault. The quick, decisive strike he had planned was gone. What replaced it was a siege. 9 months for one evening. The siege of Petersburg would grind on for 9.5 more months, from June of 1864 to April of 1865, through trench warfare that resembled nothing so much as a grim preview of a conflict still 50 years in the future. Thousands of soldiers on both sides would die in that siege who might never have had to fight it at all, if the war had ended where it nearly did, on a single evening in June, when a Union Corps commander stood at the edge of an open door and chose to close it until morning. Grant did not lose this battle to Robert E. Lee's genius. Lee was not even on the field when the opportunity was there and gone. Grant lost it to hesitation, his own subordinates' caution, a communication breakdown between corps that should have been fighting as one army, and the simple, brutal arithmetic of time that favors whichever side uses it better. Beauregard did not save Petersburg by being stronger. He saved it by being faster, and by exploiting every hour the Union Army chose not to use. History remembers Petersburg mostly for what came after: the long siege, the trenches, the final collapse of the Confederacy the following spring. It rarely lingers on the evening that made all of that necessary in the first place. But it is there, in the gap between an army that had already won and an army that had not yet realized it had lost, that the real story of Petersburg lives. Grant had the war in his hands on June 15th, 1864. He simply did not know it fast enough to close his fist.